We do have everyone. Hi, Deirdre.
Hi.
Okay, bye-bye.
I guess we wait for 2 or 3 minutes for people to come in.
Markus, can you see the slide moving?
Yes.
Okay,
perfect.
Good. Okay. Thanks.
Is everybody ready? Then I will make an opening statement and then we start. Yes. Okay, so welcome everybody to the CEBRA section 23, Monetary Policy and Macro Finance. And we will have 3 papers. We have the second paper with Discussant, the other first, and the third paper we discuss each other's paper on the go. So you please ask Q&A questions during the talk. We will also unmute you if you want to ask question in person. So everything is very open here. And the first paper will be presented by Philippe Andrade from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. It's joint work with Jordi, Gali, Herve, Bihan, and Julien Matheron. And he will tell us why should the ECB adjust its strategy in face of a lower R star, and whether it's special for the ECB or also true for the Fed. But I think he's from the Boston Fed, he probably can more easily say something about the ECB. So Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Markus, and thank you to the organizer for putting the paper in the program. So yeah, it's a paper. It's going to be a paper on the euro area. We have a companion paper that in the Brookings papers years ago that addressed the US economy. And so the motivation, so sorry, first of all, I should say that the usual disclaimer applies. And so the motivation for that paper is the now widely known fact that there has been a downward trend in the real natural rate of interest over the recent decades. And so to put things in perspective, the last time the ECB conducted a strategic review in 2003, 2% was considered as a relatively low and conservative value of R star. And now, if you look at various estimates, they are often below 1%. For instance, if you look at the economic projections, for FOMC members, the median is at 0.5%. Okay, so much lower than almost 20 years ago. And so this has some very important implications for monetary policy under a scenario of a status quo. If nothing changed, if R star is lower, then the interest rates are going to be lower on average, and so the economy will hit the effective lower bound more frequently. And because, monetary policy might be less effective at the effective lower bound, then there's a risk of undershooting the inflation target for some time. And then there's an associated consequence, which is a risk of de-anchoring of inflation expectation, which might eventually make the issue of the effective lower bound even more problematic. Okay? And so actually this downward trend in R star, or this lower level of R star, is one of the main reasons why both the Fed and the ECB conducted some review of their strategy recently. Okay. And so in this paper, we try to address the following question: should the monetary policy strategy be adjusted in the face of this lower R star? And so actually there's going to be two questions attached to this main general question. First of all, should the ECB consider raising its inflation target given an unchanged policy rule, okay, given the rule that it had been followed over the past years? And another possibility would be to change the policy rule without changing the inflation target. Okay? And so we're going to try to address these two questions, or we address this question using a quantitative welfare-based analysis, which rely on an estimated new Keynesian model for the euro area economy. Okay, and so in this setup, there's going to be two main frictions: nominal rigidities, both of prices and wages, and also there's going to be imperfect indexation to long-run inflation. And there's an effective lower bound, okay, which can be zero or can be negative. In the case of the euro area, as you know, it's slightly okay. So within that setup, there's no other friction, and so in particular, that means that there's no room for QE. QE has no impact in this. Let me give you a preview of the main findings that we have. So first of all, we show that given the estimated rule that the ECB followed over the recent years, the current inflation target, I should say actually the former inflation target, since as you may know, the ECB just released the outcome of its strategy and it adjusted the quantitative definition of price stability and also gave some signs that it will follow some form of average inflation targeting. But okay, so the current, as of yesterday, the current inflation target, which was below but close to 2%, is suboptimal if whenever you have a R star that is well below 2%. Okay, and if you want to keep that rule, the former rule unchanged, then a 1% decline in R star calls for a 0.8% increase in pi star. Okay, so quite a relatively large adjustment in the inflation target in response to drop in R star. There's some alternative to raising the inflation target, as we will show. One is beyond the scope of monetary authorities, which is to conduct aggressive counter-cyclical fiscal policies. And the other solution is to modify the monetary policy rule to incorporate some elements of making up a sufficiently strong makeup component in the rule. Quickly, we are related to three relatively narrow branches of the literature. So the one which provide quantitative analysis of R star. There's also more recently the same quantitative analysis of pi star, the quantitative of pi star with or without ZLB or NLB constraints. Okay. And then more recently, you have a bunch of quantitative analysis which look at the effectiveness of alternative strategies such as price level targeting or average inflation targeting to deal with a lower level of R star. Okay, so our contribution here compared to this study is to provide an explicit analysis of the relationship between the relation between R star and pi star, and we do that for various monetary policies. So let me give you a brief overview of the theoretical setup that we use, or
Can I ask a quick question just to, because I'm taking the role of the discussant in a sense. There's no special role for currency area. There's not, like, you can assume that the effective lower bound is different from country to country within a currency. You don't assume it's one country.
Yeah. Yes, that's perfectly true. Yeah, it was an argument that was put forward in the 2003. I mean, slightly. So the euro area heterogeneity was mentioned as an argument for having a positive inflation rate on the average for the euro area in 2003. Okay. With the idea that maybe some countries like Spain will reach 4% inflation because they were growing, they were catching up other countries, and so if you wanted to reach 0% inflation at the euro area level, then you would have to force, let's say, Germany to have negative inflation. Okay, so yeah, that's something that we completely that is completely out of our modeling assumptions here.
So the model itself is like the Fed model, in a sense. The quantification is different.
Yes,
that's correct.
Yes. Exactly. So, and actually, this is in the subtitle here. That's the model that we use is similar to the one that we had in our companion paper for the US economy. Okay. So it's a medium scale new Keynesian model. You have nominal rigidities on prices, on goods prices and wages. It's a Calvo type of rigidity. Importantly, there's the non-zero trend inflation, okay, which is different to most of these models. And also there's steady state cost attached to this non-zero trend inflation due to imperfect indexation of prices and imperfect indexation of wages. So prices will be imperfectly indexed to lag inflation, and wages will be imperfectly indexed to inflation, to price inflation, but also to productivity. You have a bunch of shocks. Some of them are demand shocks, like risk premium, marginality of consumption, monetary policy, and also supply types of shocks, technology, and price and wage market. Okay. There's technology is assumed to grow at a growth rate of UZ, and so because of we assume log utility in this model, the natural rate of interest is simply the sum of the discount rate plus the growth rate of technology. Okay, so that's relatively standard with the exception of this non-zero trend inflation and imperfect indexation. Let me also give you some details on, because this is an important part of the model, on the monetary policy rule that we postulate. So it's a policy that the monetary policy is conducted by moving the short-term interest rates, and there's a constraint on the nominal interest rates given by this effective lower bound. Okay. And whenever the constraint is not binding, the interest rate is set as this so-called notional interest rates, which follows a standard Taylor rule. Okay, so you react to inflation and inflation gap and an output gap. And very importantly, also in this Taylor rule, you have some smoothing parameter in order to take into account the fact that central banks make gradual adjustments. Okay. When the ELB constraint is binding, then that is when this notional interest rate is below the ELB, then the nominal interest rate is set at E. Okay, but what is really important to stress is that even if when you're below the effective lower bound, or the effective lower bound is binding, the notional interest rate is going to depend on past values of the notional interest rate. Okay, so the current notional interest rate is going to depend on the negative values of the past negative values of the nominal interest rate, which implies that when the traps end and when the gaps, the inflation gaps and the output gaps are closed, then you're going to still keep the interest rates at zero because of these negative past values of the notional interest rates. Okay, so that means that there's the way we specify our monetary policy rule means that the longer the trap, the slower will be the exit from the trap. Okay? You're gonna exit relatively more slowly than you would have if you didn't have this smoothing parameter here. Okay? And so this is a way to capture a form of non-conventional policies, in particular for our guidance. You can think of this as lower for longer policies, and it's a form of.
Can I ask another question? So behind that, there's a whole New Keynesian model, and you have to do some welfare analysis, I guess, in order to say what's the optimal target.
Yeah.
So the cost of inflation is just price dispersion, is this? Because there's all this argument that this price dispersion cost is too small relative to what we really think the cost of inflation are. But that's the only cost in the model of high inflation.
So, actually, in this type of, in this class of model, because of imperfect indexation, the cost of inflation can be relatively substantial. So the output is going to be below its efficient level permanently whenever you have a positive trend inflation. Okay. So, but I agree with you that there's no other cost here. Okay.
So can you explain? Sorry, if we have high inflation and no zero lower bound and nothing, there would be the cost would be more than the price dispersion, or there would be some other cost too, or not?
So no, but there's price dispersion, but there's because of imperfect. So no, with trend inflation, okay, and those ELB, there's going to be a steady state cost of price dispersion. You see what I was. Okay. It's not just fluctuation cost. Okay, because of this.
No, steady state there's always price dispersion. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's really, that's more costly than usually in this class of model, which either assume zero trend inflation or perfect indexation to trend inflation. Okay. So actually, that was we were discussing my next slide, but how somehow the discussion that was a little bit more technical than what we have on this slide. So in this model, so you have nominal rigidity, which induce price distortion and suboptimal adjustment of quantities, employment and output to macro shocks. So that makes inflation costly, but that makes also the effective development costly because there's going to be larger price distortion because the central bank lacks its usual stabilization instrument. Okay? So there's costs attached to that are induced by the lack of the stabilization instrument. Okay, so in this setup, the positive inflation target is going to be beneficial because it increases the nominal interest rates. Okay, and so it reduces the probability of hitting the effective development. But it's also going to be costly, as we were saying, because there's this imperfect indexation which distorts the relative prices and wages and output permanently, and output is going to be permanently below its efficiency. Okay, so what we're going to do is to quantify this beneficial aspect and costly aspect of inflation in that. Okay, let me give you some a brief overview of how we solve the model, estimate it, and how we compute the welfare. So the solution method is relative, it's quite standard in this class of model. You detrend the non-stationary variables by technology, which is trending. You log linearize the system around the deterministic steady state, and then you use this type of Ogden algorithm that were developed in Bodenstein, Al and Gali and Caballero, to take into account the fact that this discontinuity induced by the effective log. Okay.
So Philippe, you have about 10 minutes. I'm only worried because you have 39 slides.
Okay, no, it's less than that. But okay, so we estimate. Let me speed up.
Okay.
Um, um, uh, so we estimate the model using a Bayesian method on a pre-crisis sample. Some parameters are calibrated. Basically, here there's nothing fancy in the estimation, and we find parameter values that are in the ballpark of what previously that class of model. Okay, so then we compute, when it comes to welfare, we take a second order approximation to the household expected utility. So this household expected utility is going to depend on the model's parameter, but also on the trend inflation that is picked up by a central bank. And we define the optimal inflation as the one that maximizes welfare given the parameters of the model. Okay. And then we're going to simulate the model given the fact that there's potentially effective overbound episodes. And we compute this pi star quantitative. Okay. Notice that if you look at the pre-crisis, the pre-crisis period, in that case, the optimal inflation target is quite surprisingly in line with what was used by the ECB before. So because it's 1.8, so it's below 2%, but close to 2%. So here, in the pre-crisis period, we assume that the effective overbound was equal to 0, which was probably, at least that was the case in the 2003. Now, what we're going to do is to try to assess how pi star, so the optimal inflation rate that maximizes welfare, varies with R star. So for that, we're going to fix the model parameters at their posterior mean value. And then we're going to vary R star by playing on the technology, the growth rate of technology or the discount. Okay.
Can I just ask, if there's no effective lower bound, then the optimal inflation is 0?
Okay, no. No, it's here. It's going to be slightly negative. I'm going to tell you. Okay, so this is what we get. For the values, so this is the values of R star here on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis the optimal inflation target that you get from the simulation of our estimated models. Okay, so now the effective lower bound is assumed to be minus 0.5, and so for the pre-crisis for our estimation sample, the pre-crisis sample, R star was 2.8 according to our estimates, and so the optimal pi star is 1.4. Okay, around this area, you see that there's the slope between R star and pi star is negative, and it's relatively steep. Why is it negative? Because whenever R star declines, then there's a higher frequency of hitting the zero lower bound, and it's optimal to increase the inflation target to counterbalance this increase in the probability of hitting the effective lower bound. Okay, so here really, in this range of values, the cost of being at the LB are really important, and so this is why you're ready to pay to increase the inflation target to compensate for that, even though raising the inflation target is costly in this class of money. If you go to very large value of R star, you see that at some point the curve becomes completely flat. Why is that so? Because for this very large value of R star, whenever R star declines, there's no, the probability of hitting the effective lower bound is close to 0. So there's no need to increase pi star to avoid the effective lower bound. And as we were saying, it's slightly negative. And why is that so? It's due to the fact that there's trending growth, trending technology. Okay, so the real wage should grow at the rate of technological progress here. And because wages are imperfectly indexed to both inflation and productivity, the way it's having a negative inflation rate here is a better way to allow the real wage to be close to technology growth than the alternative, which would be to have a larger increase of the larger nominal wage inflation and zero price inflation. And so this also tells you why whenever you decline R star, you increase R star by increasing the growth rate of technology, the optimal inflation in this model is more and more negative.
The size of the shocks, you don't vary that. Now you're saying the world became more risky after the.
In that sense, we are pretty conservative here because, post 2008, you might assume that the shocks, the variance of the shocks increase, and of course that will call for a higher value of pi star. Okay.
And that's a non-linear. Is this interesting to vary the size of the shock?
So this is an exercise that we conducted for the US economy, and so what you would get basically is a shift, an upward shift of this.
Okay, I shouldn't slow you down because we are running.
No, let's take it as a on-the-spot discussion.
By the way, if people have questions, please chime in, type it in, or raise your hand, and I will. I'm not sure whether I can actually unmute you, but everybody should ask questions.
I have a quick question, actually. I don't want to slow down, but how do you think about QE in this context? It seems like, at least in this recession, QE seems to have been a pretty good substitute. So that seems relevant for this trade-off. So, how do you think about that?
No, okay. So as I was mentioning at the very beginning, that there's no QE there. So you can think, the only way you can think of QE is a way that allowed to put the whole yield curve on a path where that was consistent with market expecting that the increase in the nominal interest rate after the end of the trap was super slow. That's the only way we can think of QE in this context. But more generally, you would like to. I mean, it's a very interesting question, but I think we also need to have if you want to put QE in this discussion, you need to have a model where QE has some trade-off. I mean, has some cost as well, because here, for a lot of central bankers who say, well, let's just use QE and that's going to solve everything. They don't think, or they don't have a model of where QE has some cost as well.
Thank you.
So the last point I wanted to say is that, okay, so if you look here at the slope of the curve, it's going to be, as I was saying, minus 0.8. So if you reduce the real R star by 1 percentage point, you would move from 1.4 here to 2.2 as an optimal inflation target. Okay, and of course, if you go a little bit further below, close to 1% here, you would have to increase the inflation target a little bit above 2.5. So as I was saying, there's also some alternative strategy. The first one that we consider is, what happens if, in addition to monetary policy that is conducted at the level of the euro area, there's also some form of coordination of fiscal policy, and which can, implement the following type of policy. Whenever the output gap is, the cumulative output gap is minus 6% over the last 4 quarters, then, those fiscal authorities can increase their government spending by 4% of output, so very large fiscal intervention. And then when, the output gap goes above this minus 6%, you return to zero, but with a very, very large autoregressive process. So the return to normal is very slow. And so if you do that, then the optimal inflation target that you would get before the drop in R star would be, close to 0.5, actually 0.4. So much lower than 1.4, which was what we had before with no emergency fiscal package. And you see that you can be still below 0 for values of R star that are close to 1%. Okay. So it's a very effective way to avoid changing the strategy and to avoid changing, both in terms of the policy rule and the target. Something that is also interesting is to look, and Markus, you probably like this one, to look at the effect of the effective lower bound. So we don't have any cost of the effective lower bound here, but what we see is that if you go to a little bit further below minus 0.5, then you don't gain much. Okay, so this is illustrated in this chart. Actually, so if you move from 0, an ALB at 0 to minus 5, you see that you reduce the optimal inflation target by 0.3. Okay, you go from 1.7 to 1.4. And then if you go further below to minus 80 basis points as an effective lower bound, you can reduce a little bit further your optimal inflation target, but not much. You get less than 30 basis points. You go to 1.2. Okay, and so
okay, can I ask another question? I know that we have to stop soon, but if I lower the productivity growth rate by 50 basis points and I lower the effective lower bound also by 50 basis points, it doesn't move in parallel. Now, can you give me an intuition why it doesn't move in parallel? That's because of this.
Say again, Markus. Sorry. So if you lower
I lower productivity growth by 50 basis, half a percentage points, and I also lower the effective lower bound from 0.5 to minus 0.5 to minus 1%.
Yeah. So why you don't get just a compensation by dropping the effective lower bound by the same amount than the drop in the technology rate? So actually, technology rate. So the technology is going to have some impact on the dynamics of the model.
Mm-hmm.
So there's which breaks down the one-to-one mapping, and you have to think of So that's basically it, and then the trade-off, and basically what we have is that the trade-off between increasing the inflation target or lowering the inflation target in that case, and having a larger probability to be at the effective lower bound is also not one-to-one. Okay, so and here basically what another way to say so is that it's not clear that you maintain the probability of hitting the zero lower bound constant if you reduce the effective lower bound by the same amount than the drop in technology. Okay, because of the so that's I think a clear way.
Just warn you, we have about 3 minutes. Okay.
Okay. I think I'll be able to make it. So so you don't gain much with lowering the effective lower bound. Now, what is very powerful in this type of model is making up fast. So we have 3 ways to have some form of makeup in this setup. So first, you can consider increasing the inertia coefficient in the policy rule. Okay, so moving from our baseline is 0.87, you can move to 95, and you see that. So the baseline was the blue curve here. If you increase the smoothing parameter in the Taylor rule and in the notional rate below the effective lower bound, you move to this curve here and to this purple curve here, and you see that pre-crisis the effective the optimal inflation rate would be close to 0 in this with this more lower for longer type of policy. And this is already the spirit of what you get. I mean, this gives you the spirit of what you get when you move to price level targeting of average inflation target. Okay, so if you go to price level targeting, so if now you have you react not to an inflation gap to a price level gap with the Taylor rule, so-called Taylor rule. You get something which is actually here, the scale is not the same, but you have an optimal inflation target which is negative pre-crisis. And if you go to R star, which is close to 1%, it will be still very low. Okay, and so if you were to move to pure price level targeting, then the ECB could lower its inflation target rather than increase. The last thing that we consider is average inflation targeting. And so here, instead of reacting to an inflation gap, you react to the difference between average inflation and a target. And you can consider, various windows over which you compute the target. So 1 quarter, 4 years, and 8 years. And this is what we get. So still the blue line is the baseline here. With an average inflation targeting of with a window of 4 years, you see that pre-crisis, the optimal inflation rate would be close to 0.5, and that you can be close to 2% even for R star, which is equal to 1%. Okay, so that's probably something that is close to the recent announcement of the ECB since they decided to go for a 2% inflation, symmetric 2% inflation, and with some form of making up when inflation is below the target for some time because of the effective lower. Notice that in our quantitative exercise, the window that you need to get there is relatively large because you need to have a 4-year window. Of course. This is, what will be the window is still a very much open question with this type of strategy, both for the Fed and this.
We have to come to a close. Oh, okay.
Let me stop here. I can, just what I want to emphasize here in this conclusion is that monetary policy strategy, and in particular the inflation target, is not something that is that should be considered as universal constant, but it's something that should be adjusted to the structural changes of the economy. And in that regard, the fact that the Fed and the ECB decided to conduct regular reviews of the strategy, I think is good.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philippe. Are there any questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A. Anybody wants to raise their hands or? Otherwise, I will ask a question again. So what are the main lessons, what's different between the ECB and the Fed? It seems that's one question. And the other question is, perhaps in 1 minute, you can answer them both. It seems like the persistent parameter matters much more than inflation target. Do you think that our discussion is misguided? We should focus much less on inflation target, but we should focus, your paper should have called, how much forward guidance should we do in the light of an effective?
So thanks, actually, that's okay.
Oh,
so for the first question, the difference between the euro area and the Fed, so actually in this class of model, when you look at the estimates, of the parameters that drive the imperfections, they're not so different. So of course, you believe or not in whether this class of model is a good description of what are the main imperfections for the macroeconomic outcomes. But it's not super surprising that we get something that is not too different. One thing that is missing here, and that's a point that you already addressed, if you start playing with the variance of the shocks, then you can really change the optimal inflation quite dramatically and move to an inflation rate which would be closer to 4 or 5% in both economies. That's my answer to your first point. Now the second point. Okay, so I think you're touching on the fact that in these models, the inflation expectation channel is extremely powerful, too powerful. You know that, okay? And so whenever, that's another instance of the four-guidance puzzle, okay? However, we know that, that channel can be mitigated because of imperfect information. So this is my discussions here, cognitive bias or financial constraints, okay? And so all this will make the so-called make-up strategy and the fact that you make the commitment, the horizon of the commitment to lower interest rates longer and longer, less effective in reality than in this class of model, okay? And so here I think your remark is completely valid in the context of our model. But if you were to start playing, having less powerful inflation expectation channel, then the relative interest of increasing the inflation target rather than moving to making a strategy would be more important.
So essentially, this model is subject to the forward guidance paradox or puzzle, whatever it's called.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we're running out of time, so I have to stay a little bit on time. So thanks a lot. I think a very insightful presentation we learned. And so the next presentation is by Alp Simsek, a joint paper with Ricardo Caballero, titled Monetary Policy with Opinionated Markets. And it will be discussed by Jenny Tang. Alp, you have a little bit less time because Jenny needs some time too. So we go for 20 plus 10 plus 10.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Again, please ask questions if you have questions in the middle. Or even
okay. Okay, thank you, Markus. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hold on. I wasn't sure. Okay, so this paper is motivated by the observation that the Fed, central banks, and financial markets often disagree about future interest rates. So in this panel, the right panel, the dots correspond to the dot curve, which arguably reflect the median FOMC members' predictions for future rates. And on the left panel, the dots are Green Book policy rate assumptions, which reflect the Fed staff's predictions. And in either panel, the solid lines show for the matched meetings, the forward curve, which arguably reflects the market's predictions for future interest rates. And as you see, the two predictions rarely line up. There are sometimes big gaps. Of course, you may want to do some adjustments to this figure, including cleansing the forward curve from risk premium effects. But if you do those adjustments or measure the beliefs alternative methods, you find that these gaps basically remain. This is not even a US specific phenomenon. In other countries where central banks publish their interest rate forecasts, similar gaps are observed. So we think these gaps point to genuine disagreements about appropriate monetary policy. For instance, if you have a situation like this where the market thinks interest rates will be higher than what the Fed thinks, the market implicitly thinks the Fed is setting or planning to set too low interest rates, making a policy mistake, if you want, in the direction of too loose policy. And in fact, we had a situation like that very recently. A few months ago, market, right now things have changed a little bit, but a few months ago, the market seems to have thought that the fiscal packages will translate into large inflationary pressures and the Fed is behind the curve and we might have inflation. In fact, Deutsche Bank did a survey among its clients, and two of the top three concerns in the survey are related to policy mistakes. One of them is literally a central bank policy error, and the other is inflation being too high than expected. Okay, so motivated by these observations, we build a model with the key feature that the markets will in fact have a different view than central bank about future activity and therefore appropriate policy. And in particular, we're going to make the market and the Fed disagree about aggregate demand. There's going to be a process in the model that drives aggregate demand, and the market and the Fed will disagree about that. And it will be an opinionated disagreement, agree to disagree type heterogeneity. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily rational. They will both learn from the data. It's just that they don't learn from each other. They don't think the other guy has any information that they haven't already incorporated. And we're going to be somewhat agnostic about where these disagreements come from. We can talk about that later. But given these disagreements, we obtain a number of results. First, we show that disagreements about demand can explain the rates disagreements that I showed you earlier. Second, But we go beyond, it goes beyond explaining that figure, actually. We find that these disagreements matter for optimal policy rate that the Fed needs to set. In particular, even though the Fed in our model thinks the market is wrong, it accommodates the market somewhat, but it also plans to implement its view more forcefully in the future, as it expects the market to learn and come closer to its view in the future. So it's a policy framework, what we call expected gradualism. The Fed expects to move more gradually. And third, we find that these disagreements can also lead to endogenous monetary policy shocks. So in this framework, basically the revelation of the Fed's belief to the market acts like a monetary policy shock. And it's not like in the Keynesian model, like a random interest rate movement. It's an endogenous or micro-founded shock because it's ultimately driven by beliefs. In fact, these shocks will be optimal from the perspective of the Fed, but they will look like shocks from the perspective of the market because they have different beliefs. Fourth, we can actually have a less optimal version of these shocks, what we call tantrum shocks, which are more damaging versions of these shocks. And we find that they motivate additional gradualism. Fed acts even more cautiously than in the baseline setting, and also motivate Fed communication policies of the type we've seen in recent decades. And finally, we find that when you add inflation to the model, these disagreements actually affect inflation, current inflation, and create a policy trade-off for the Fed that's very similar to cost push shocks, even though the model doesn't have cost push shocks per se. Okay, so let me get directly to the model in the interest of time and try to show you these results in a bit more detail.
I have one quick clarifying question. Who is right, the market or the Fed, in terms of the planner when you calculate your welfare, the optimal monetary policy?
So the planner acts according to its own belief. We don't take a stand on who is right. There is some literature on this, or doing forecasting horse races, and they don't find a clear winner. So the typical finding is that the reality ends up being somewhere in between. The forecasting errors are similar, but we're not going to take a stand on that because most of our results are about the beliefs, about not better.
No, I don't mean in the real world, but when you say optimal monetary policy.
Okay, so it's optimal under the Fed's belief. Because the Fed will come. Okay, so that's actually a good clarifying question. Okay. I think it will become clear when you see the model. So it's basically three equations in the Keynesian model. We make the appropriate modification to insert disagreements. In particular, the IS curve is exactly like in the textbook. We're going to focus on the demand shocks, which basically we're going to capture by making growth stochastic. So, but its functional role in the model is going to be shift demand, as you see in the IS curve. When G is high, expected activity is high, and that's a demand shifter. Okay, so when G is low, market expects low activity, low demand. So for now, I'm going to assume fully sticky prices. Later, we're going to also introduce the Philippe's curve. Monetary policy, so we'll, given the prices are sticky, we'll focus on closing output gaps. And for most of our analysis, the Fed will stabilize output gaps on average. Here is where we depart from the textbook model. We're going to assume the Fed sets the rate before seeing the shock for the period. So the period is as follows. The Fed moves first, sets the interest rate, and then the shock is realized, and then the market moves and sets output gaps and so on. Why do we make this assumption? Because if you don't make an assumption in the textbook model, the Fed moves after seeing everything. It can basically set gaps to zero state by state. The Fed's belief is irrelevant. You want to make Fed's judgment relevant, which of course is realistic. Fed's judgment really matters in practice. This is a way of capturing that in the model. Okay. Second, importantly, this is our key assumption. We're going to make the market and the Fed have different beliefs, different judgments. And that leads to the core tension of the model, because the market thinks the Fed is making monetary policy mistakes. The market thinks the Fed should be doing policy with an M superscript. But going back to Markus' question, the Fed is doing what is optimal under its belief. The Fed is doing it with F superscript. So the market thinks the Fed won't stabilize the gaps on average. It will set incorrect rates and will have too low or too high gaps depending on the situation. Okay, so and the key insight of the paper is that these mistakes matter for the Fed's current policy as well. Why? Because you can take the IS curve and apply this policy rule here, set the expectation under Fed to zero, and then you can solve for the policy rate the Fed needs to set. And if you look at that, you see basically the market's perceived mistakes for the future periods enter the Fed's policy rule. Why? Because when the market perceives mistakes, too high or too low gaps in the future, you see through the IS curve, they immediately shift current activity. They become an endogenous demand shifter. When the Fed is wrong in the direction of too high gaps, that's a basically positive demand shifter, and the Fed is forced to react to that. Even though the Fed doesn't care per se about the market's belief, it's forced to react to that to hit its target, right? So, of course, to understand exactly how the Fed reacts, we need to peel the onion further. We need to specify these beliefs. And we saw these equations under the following specification. We can generalize this quite a bit, but we wanted to consider a very simple specification that captures the economics of the problem. So the demand shocks have two components. There's a persistent component and a transitory component. And we're going to make the agents disagree about the persistent component. So disagreements somewhat persist. In particular, G0M is the market's belief prior for the persistent component, and G0F is the Fed's prior, and they're different. And C0 is the confidence, is the initial beliefs. That matters because it controls the speed of learning. Even if the agents don't get any other information here, as you see, the realizations of the demand shocks will be endogenous signals of the persistent component. They're going to learn about the persistent component as they observe activity, and C controls how they learn, right? So in particular, we assume agents are Bayesian, conditional initial different beliefs. So then you get very sort of simple Bayesian updating rule. The conditional belief at a period is a weighted average of the last period's belief and the most recent data realization. Here in this example, the Fed is initially more optimistic, the purple line. The market is less optimistic. You see, they both move in the direction of the data, but because they're somewhat confident, disagreements persist into the future. The dashed line is what happens when confidence is low. In that case, disagreements will disappear more quickly. But either way, you see in our model, disagreements disappear eventually. That, of course, shouldn't be taken literally. We could actually change the model to insert recurring disagreements. But again, our point is not realism here, but to capture the economics of the problem, to focus on one disagreement cycle. Okay, so and we make agents Bayesian conditional initial beliefs. That's again a simplifying assumption. But one thing that the Bayesian assumption buys us is agents not only learn, they also expect the other agent to learn over time, right? So how do we see that? Here, the purple solid line is what the Fed thinks its own views will be in the future. It's a flat line because the Fed doesn't think it will change its own mind on average, right? It's a law of iterated expectations. But if you look at the dotted purple line, that's what the Fed thinks the market's view will be in the future. And that's kind of coming closer to the Fed's view. The Fed thinks the market will come closer to its view in the future. Why does the Fed think that? Because the Fed thinks that it's right. And the data realization in these periods will validate that, and the market will come to see the world like the Fed does. Of course, the market thinks exactly the opposite. And this actually will be important for understanding the fanning out of the interest rate predictions. Now I'm ready to show you results. Let me first consider a benchmark with common beliefs. In this case, actually, things are completely standard. The policy rate reflects the conditional belief of aggregate demand, and the aggregate demand is stabilized on average, but shocks move it because of this timing, policy timing assumption. And if you look at the forward and dot curves, the markets and the Fed's expectations for future rates in this benchmark, you see basically they're a flat line, they lie on top of one another, and they reflect the current views on aggregate demand, right? So now here is our main result. What happens when you add disagreements, when you make G0F and G0M different? So you see policy rate now is different. You might think based on what I showed, it should be rho plus GF. It's not. Instead, the Fed takes into account the market's view as well, sets a weighted average of the two ideal interest rates. Okay, so and when C is high, when confidence is high, in fact, the Fed puts a lot more weight on the market's view than its own view, even though it thinks the market is wrong. And if you look at and by doing that, the Fed still stabilizes things on average around its view. And the second part says that unlike the benchmark, the forward and the dot curves don't lie on top of another; they fan out. So we explain the first figure I showed you. So let me show you this result in a picture. So in this picture, I show you the Fed's and the market's expectations for future rates, dot and forward curves for different specifications of beliefs. Let's focus on the left panel. So the dashed lines here are common belief benchmarks. So the lower dashed line is when both the market and the Fed thinks interest rate should be 6%, and the curves lie on top of one another at 6%. The upper dashed line is when they both think it should be 7%. So again, we have a flat line. So the solid lines show what happens when the Fed thinks it should be 7%, but the market thinks it should be 6%. As you see, the Fed doesn't set 7%, even though it thinks that's the ideal rate. It sets something like 6.2%. That's the first part of the result. And as you see, the predictions for future rates fan out, and the Fed's predictions converge to the Fed's ideal rate, and the market's prediction converge to the market's ideal rate. That's the second part of the result. Now, why do we have this result? So if you think about this example, the market thinks the rate should be 6%, but the Fed is setting something different, something higher, because it's optimistic about activity, so it hikes the rates. And all these interest rate hikes are mistakes according to the market, right? So here's the important thing. Not only the current rate goes up, future expected rates go up as well. Why? Because disagreements persist. Even with Bayesian learning, current disagreements will persist into the future. So when the Fed hikes the interest rate, the market expects that those interest rate hikes to remain. And those future interest rate hikes, as reflected in the shift of the forward curve, immediately tighten current activity, right? You can see it through the IS curve, right? There are the negative gaps. The market thinks negative gaps in the future, and so that will weigh down activity. Or you can just think more directly, as the forward curve lifts up, the long-term rates go up. It's basically direct monetary tightening, right? So the Fed doesn't need to do much here to tighten activity, even though it's optimistic by 1 percentage point. There's already a built-in tightening through the forward curve. So that's why the Fed hikes the rates only a little bit. How much the Fed needs to hike? Essentially, the Fed is trying to engineer a 1 percentage point lift up of the forward curve cumulatively here. So how much you need to hike depends on the area under the forward curve here. And that's going to be bigger when C is bigger. When agents are more confident disagreements persist into the future, then this area is bigger and you need to hike only very little bit. When C is low, disagreements disappear quickly. So then, in fact, you need to hike quite a bit to hit your target. Okay, so why do we get the fanning out of interest rate predictions? Well, everyone here knows the policy framework is this. The policy framework in this model is that the Fed says a weighted average of the two views. They disagree about what the inputs into the framework will be in the future periods. The Fed thinks the market will come, for the result that I showed you, come to see the world like it does. So even under that framework, it will set rates that are more reflective of its ideal rate. And the market thinks the opposite, and that's why we have so the fanning out of interest rate are driven by learning. Learning is important for that result. Let me now switch gears and tell you how we use this model to think about monetary policy shocks. So far, I've assumed that agents know each other. Not only they disagree, but they also know each other's beliefs. But we can relax that. Imagine a situation where it's basically the same model, with the only difference that the market doesn't know the Fed's initial belief, and it thinks it's driven by according to some distribution. So the idea is the Fed had developed some view recently about the demand, but the market doesn't know that yet. And we envision that either a policy decision or a speech will reveal that belief to the market. And it turns out this actually acts like a monetary policy shock in this model. So in particular, in this slight extension of the model, the Fed sets exactly the same rate as before. This is the same rate as I showed you earlier. And if you look at this formula, you see interest rate and the Fed's belief move 1-to-1. So by setting this rate, the Fed effectively reveals its belief to the market, and then we are back to agree to disagree. We are back to the earlier model. But the interesting thing is that at the time of the policy announcement, something happens. The market learns the Fed's view. Let's say if the Fed is more optimistic than what the market thought it was, the market learns that, and the current rate goes up. The whole forward curve shifts up, right? So basically, like this example that I showed you earlier. So the market starts expecting more negative gaps than before the announcement. If there were asset prices, they would decline. So basically, this looks like textbook shocks for most purposes. But they're endogenous textbook shocks. The Fed is not randomly setting interest rates; it's raising the interest rate because it is optimistic, right? So in fact, we call these optimal shocks because these shocks are optimal under the Fed's belief, right? And that actually leads to a subtlety. If you want to think about the empirical regressions that people run from the lens of this model, imagine we are regressing the output gaps on monetary policy shocks or inflation on monetary policy shocks. When do you expect to find the usual coefficients? Now this is one place, Markus, where who is right matters. When the market is right, you will expect to find the negative coefficient because the market is right. In fact, that interest rate hike was a mistake, and it's going to be on average followed by negative gaps. Okay, but if the Fed is right, you're going to get zero coefficient in these regressions because the Fed is by design is setting the rate to target a zero gap, and if the Fed is right, the gaps will be zeroing. So the model makes its contingent predictions on how monetary policy shocks empirically should affect output gaps or inflation. If you think reality is somewhere in between, which is a reasonable assumption in a context with disagreement, then you're going to recover the usual coefficients. But the more the Fed is right, the smaller and less significant coefficient you'll find. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, these are so far optimal monetary policy shocks. They're quite benign because the Fed is shocking the forward curve optimally to provide the appropriate tightening given its views. Well, we can break that. And then if you break that, you get to basically what we call tantrum shocks, more damaging shocks. What do we need to do to break that? Well, first of all, we need to assume that. Yes.
Can I just, because Refrat has a question, assume the Fed is absolutely correct in its assessment of the state. Policy action will be surprise in the event study sense, but conditional on public's information, but there will be no shock in the VAR sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to say. Thanks, Refrat, for clarifying that. In a VAR sense, in fact, you're going to find nothing if the Fed is exactly right. You get the usual coefficient as long as Fed is not too right, if the reality is somewhere between the Fed and the market. Thanks for that clarification.
Okay. And we have about 2-3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about these tantrum shocks in the remaining time. So So how do we get to tantrum or more damaging shocks? First of all, we need to assume the Fed's belief as a higher dimension. So, why we need that? Because we want the interest rate policy decision not to reveal the Fed's belief fully. And that's a realistic assumption because beliefs in practice are a very high dimensional complex objects. So we're going to make the Fed possibly optimistic about the long term or short term. And the second, market doesn't quite know that. So when it sees an interest rate hike, it learns the Fed is optimistic, but it doesn't really know whether it's a longer term optimism or shorter term. And it's going to interpret it according to a parameter in the model tau. When it's closer to 1, the market will interpret interest rate hikes as reflecting longer term optimism and the whole forward curve will lift up. When it's closer to 0, the forward curve won't lift up very much. And here's the crucial assumption. We're going to assume the Fed doesn't quite know the market's tau. So the Fed cannot predict how the forward curve will react to its decision. That gets us to tantrums. There are 2 scenarios that you can think about. The first is when the Fed is basically wrong and underestimates the market's tau, and that leads to a taper tantrum type situation. The Fed, let's say, is optimistic by 1 percentage point and think the market is unreactive. So the Fed basically hikes the rate by 1% here because it doesn't think the forward curve will lift up. But unbeknownst to the Fed, market turns out to be reactive and interprets as a long-term thing, and the whole forward curve lifts up. You see, this mistakes area now can be quite big, and these are unintentional. The Fed shocks the forward curve too much than it intended, so it actually misses its target even under its own, right? So, of course, it's an extreme assumption. We made the Fed wrong about markets type, but we think this captures elements of what's happening in a taper tantrum size situation, like in 2013. The Fed hikes the rates for a one-time concern, and the market tightens policy for a one-time concern. The market misinterprets it and thinks it's a longer term. It's the first installment of a longer term tightening type situation. The more common situation is the market might be reactive or unreactive, and the Fed doesn't really know that, right? So we modeled that as well. And the result that we have here is that the Fed actually does a weighted average across the 2 scenarios, but it overweights the case where the market is the tantrum or the reactive type relative to its probability of happening. You put more weight on the tantrum scenarios. Why are you doing that? Well, because those scenarios are a lot more damaging, right? So if the market turns out to be of tantrum type, you're going to miss your output gap by quite a bit. So what the Fed ends up doing is overweighting that case and sacrificing some mean, even under its ex ante belief. Actually, the Fed hikes because it hikes the rates more cautiously. It doesn't set the gaps to 0. It's sacrificing some mean to reduce the variance, because it's worried about these tantrum scenarios, and in which case the gaps are big and variance grows. Okay, so it's actually an example of an older point by William Brainard, where if you're uncertain about how your policy rate will hit the economy, you want to move more cautiously, more gradually. In our context, the thing that makes the Fed as uncertain is the possibility that markets might be of the tantrum type, and you might do too much tightening that sort of makes you more cautious, okay, even more than the baseline. But even with this additional cautiousness, with these tantrums, the Fed basically will miss its gap more often than in the baseline scenario case I showed you earlier. So that gets us to Fed communication policies. The Fed can try to mitigate these tantrums by communication. The first is the Fed might try to figure out the market's reaction, right? Because once you know tau, you can divide policy appropriately. Actually, New York Fed is doing a survey of, dealers, seems to be trying to get at this space, how the market will react to a policy shock. But the second thing that you could think about doing here is the Fed can reveal its belief to the market, because once the market knows your belief, you know how they're going to interpret your decisions. You're going to be back at agree to disagree type scenario, and you can shock the forward rate exactly as you want. Okay, so we actually have a role for Fed communication policies here that reveal the Fed's view of the economy, not because you're trying to persuade the market. The market is opinionated and is not persuaded, but to get to an agree to disagree type scenario. You want the market at least to know what you think, because when the market knows that, you can shock the forward curve and set appropriate policy. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this results with inflation, and I'm going to stop here. I think I'm already over time.
Thanks a lot, Alp. So discuss this Yuliy Tang, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. The usual disclaimer applies since I'm from the Boston Fed. So Alp gave a very interesting motivation for the paper, which is that you do see these disagreements in the data. I think there's actually, when I saw the paper, I thought of another motivation for it, which is that it's kind of a natural next step in the dissection of monetary policy shocks. So there's been this big recent literature considering, in addition to classical monetary policy shocks, the existence also of these Fed information shocks where interest rate surprises reveal the Fed's information about the economy. And I think coming from this perspective, it's very natural to then ask, well, what if the public doesn't believe the Fed is even right about the economy? What if the public can't distinguish between different aspects of the Fed's information? And what if the Fed is then also wrong or uncertain about how the public will interpret policy action? So I think coming from this perspective, this is also a very natural direction to move in thinking about what these interest rate surprises and their effects are. And so this paper answers these questions in the context of opinionated beliefs and persistent disagreements between the Fed and the markets. And I see several interesting contributions of this paper, which is that it's giving a very novel microfoundation for classical monetary policy shocks, where interest rate surprises aren't actual mistakes by the Fed, but they are changes in the Fed's beliefs that just the market perceives to be mistakes. A second contribution is to introduce a justification for gradualism that is based on a fear of misinterpretation by the markets of the Fed's actions. And this model also motivates communication to reduce inefficiencies created by the market's misperception of the Fed's beliefs. So I'm going to skip over the kind of overview of the model because I think Alp did a good job on that, and also in the interest of time. Just quickly to review some of the main results in the setting where the markets and the Fed just agree to disagree. Alp showed that there's some accommodation of market beliefs by the Fed. And here I just want to highlight that this really is just an opportunistic accommodation. In this setting, the disagreement is pretty much benign because from the perspective of the Fed, any excess market pessimism or optimism just moves output in the direction that they want anyway. So the accommodation is really just because rates don't have to move by as much for the Fed to achieve what they want. When you have partially sticky prices, Alp didn't get to show this, but from the perspective of the Fed, very intuitively, disagreements generate an output inflation trade-off. And so it's generating what the Fed perceives to be cost push shocks. So things go a little bit more wrong when the market doesn't correctly infer changes in Fed's beliefs. So when there are shocks to Fed's beliefs about both short and long-term activity, and unbeknownst to the Fed, the market actually over-extrapolates all the Fed's actions to reflect these more persistent changes in beliefs. The forward curve moves by more than what the Fed intends, which is the tantrum, and even the Fed at that point would then expect a negative output gap. And so by failing to anticipate the market's reaction, the Fed actually itself overreacts to its short-term belief shocks. So knowing this, when the Fed recognizes that these tantrums are possible, they optimally act more gradually than even the certainty equivalent benchmark would imply. And so for this reason, communication is beneficial in these settings, just for the mere purpose of getting rid of these misunderstandings, even if it doesn't change what the market thinks about the actual economy. So one comment, or really it's more of a question that I have here, is that I see this pretty clearly, and it's intuitive in the fully sticky price setting, where essentially these are all just demand shocks. And so here it's clear that more information about the Fed's beliefs is good. I have a question though, if you consider this in the partial stickiness case, where these disagreements are showing up as cost push shocks, whether communication is still beneficial there. Because as we know from the work of Andrade and Bihan in 2007, when the equilibrium is inefficient, even when the market does know the Fed's beliefs, which is the case explored in the paper, because of these cost push shocks, then communication might not always be beneficial. So that's one question I have about communication in this setting. So next, I want to just talk about how this model produces monetary policy shocks. So here we can compare what happens to different variables to the case of quote unquote standard monetary policy shocks. So you have your classical interest rate shocks, where when the interest rate goes up, the output gap falls, and everyone knows this. And then you also have the Fed information shocks that people have been talking about more recently, in which the interest rate surprises are reflecting changes in the Fed's beliefs, but the market also uses this information in informing their own beliefs. And so when interest rates go up for this reason, output gaps go up, and the market and the Fed both expect this. So if you actually only look at actual outcomes, Fed belief shocks that are ex post correct can actually resemble Fed information shocks, because you have the actual output gap going up. And Fed belief shock, which Alp said most resembled the standard monetary policy shocks, I'll point out that that's true, except when you look at the relationship with the Fed's own forecasts. Right, so in the kind of classical sense, these are just mistakes. And so when these exogenous interest rate shocks happen, even the Fed knows that this will hurt the output gap. But in this model, they believe that what they're doing is correct. So that is one thing that distinguishes classical interest rate shocks from Fed belief shocks in this model. And because these relationships with forecasts are really important, I'll show some data on that next. So here I'm just plotting interest rate surprises. I took these from the Yaroshinsky and Karate 2020 paper against forecast revisions of the Fed's 1 year ahead GDP forecast. And so what you see is that it kind of splits in half, right? So you have about half of the cases where it does look like the Fed is raising rates when they revise up their forecast of future GDP. And this is a revision that's happening just prior to the rate decision. And but the other half of the cases actually do kind of look like standard interest rate shocks, where even when the Fed forecasts that GDP will be higher than they previously thought, the actual rate surprise that happens is a negative one. And so to really understand what's going on in the context of this model, we also have to look at what's happening with market beliefs. So the next set of graphs incorporates that as well. So in the time series, I'm showing these are the set of interest rate surprises, the brighter red against the lighter red, which is all the other surprises. So these highlighted ones are the ones where you see that the rate surprise is moving in opposition to the Fed's own forecast revisions, and the market's forecast revisions are also moving in the same direction as the Fed's, right? So this is kind of what looks like a standard monetary policy shock. And this is about a third of the sample. And it's pretty evenly distributed over time. Now, if you look at the cases where it seems like the Fed is responding or leaning against their own GDP forecast revisions, you see that about 2/3 of those look like information shocks, in the sense that the Fed seems to be leaning against their own GDP forecast revisions, but then subsequently the private market forecasts also move in the same direction as the Fed's. The remaining 1/3 of that, half of the distribution seems to be seems to look like Fed belief shocks as described in this model, where the Fed is leaning against their own forecast revisions, but the private market forecasts move the opposite way. And so here you do see, of course, this is all just very suggestive, and there are a lot of caveats to this exercise in terms of needing to look at other variables like inflation and potentially unemployment as well. But here, what I found kind of interesting is that it does look like these belief shocks are more prevalent in the earlier part of the sample than the later part of the sample. And this might have something to do with the fact that the Fed is communicating more now than it used to. Another big caveat here is that I don't have the actual famous taper tantrum within this sample of interest rate surprises. And that's where things in this model really line up with what's happening in the real world in a very dramatic way. So I'm showing some evidence that during the taper tantrum of 2013, right before, the markets and the Fed really were disagreeing a lot about both the economy on the left. I'm showing GDP forecasts and how much they're disagreeing there. And also their disagreement about policy is really large at that time too. So of course, then it wasn't the funds rate policy that people were disagreeing about, but it was asset purchases. And here I'm showing the median dealer projections in the green line and the projections made by the Fed staff under a few different policy alternatives, where usually the most popular alternative is alternative B, the black line here. So they were really disagreeing quite a lot about both leading up to the taper tantrum. And we kind of all know what happened then. One thing that's interesting was that during their policy discussion at the meeting just before the taper tantrum occurred, policymakers were very aware of the disagreement and the potential signaling effects of their actions. And even so, the market still surprised them with how much they reacted to Ben Bernanke's May 2013 testimony. Another thing that was discussed in the meeting, I think that later showed up in a paper by Jeremy Stein, is this idea that he was talking about of an expectational trap. And so the quote is a bit long, but what he was essentially trying to say was that when the Fed is trying to be gradual and to not surprise markets, this might actually make markets more reactive. And this, he captured this idea in his paper as a kind of inefficient form of gradualism. So I think that might be here in this paper as well, where gradualism is optimal, but you can think about what about communication about gradualism. And so in the tantrum case in the paper, it's worse for the Fed when the market thinks that they know that the market is reactive. And so when the market thinks that the Fed is will be reacting less, this is worse. So in some sense, is it better for the Fed to try to convince markets that they're not reacting less? And so that's a question I have for Alp about how that works in this model.
So we have about 30 seconds.
Sure. So I'm just about to wrap up. And so another thought I had was just what are some lessons for researchers and policymakers that come out of this paper? So of course, measuring and managing the market's reactiveness is an important issue. And here I think there may be some evidence of changing reactiveness over time coming from this paper by Hansen, Luca, and Wright, showing that long-term yields have become more sensitive to movements in short rates over time. And so is that an indication that this tau is actually increasing over time? And in reality, the Fed's beliefs probably do sometimes influence markets. So these like Fed information shocks probably do show up once in a while. And so measuring the policy's likely influence on market beliefs is probably also important for determining the right policy. And lastly, just empirically, how does ignoring Fed belief shocks in empirical work bias inferences about other important elasticities? So I'm just wondering if this paper can also shed some light on that. But just to sum up, I think it's a really cool paper that has a really rich set of results from a small model, which is quite impressive. And it makes quite a few important contributions to the literature and raises some interesting further questions for communication and empirical inference.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for this thorough and insightful discussion. Let me just give 1 minute or 30 seconds to Alp to respond. And also inject Treffet's comment. He said Barbara Rossi has a nice paper that shows what maybe information surprises are becoming less prevalent and relating to the communication. It's a CPR paper. And let me also throw one additional question. If you were to have Fed meetings every 2 weeks, like in the last part of the paper, then would this make a difference? Then you can smooth out, you can reveal more information in smaller steps rather than every 6 weeks or whatever it is. Alp, the floor is yours for 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jenny, for a really outstanding discussion, a lot of food for thought. Given the limited time, I won't be able to say. So one thing that you mentioned was that the communication, is it useful when there is inflation as well? That's actually a great question. We didn't show that. And my prior thinking was that, well, if you don't communicate, you basically adjust noise to the gap. So it tends to be worse. But I think not communicating is not ideal, but you may want to strategically communicate in that setting. That would be interesting to think about. Maybe you want the market to think your view is closer to their view because that helps to mitigate this cost. So that's actually very interesting. We haven't really thought about that. In terms of the relation to information shocks, yeah, absolutely, there's a relation. One thing I want to point out is that implications for asset prices are different. When the market actually sees the rate hike and infers information from it, actually stock prices would go up because the market now becomes more optimistic. In our model, it goes down. Right, so that's actually one thing that differentiates the two. And also in terms of the empirics of these information shocks, I think using the market's change in blue chip revisions is a little bit dangerous. And there's a paper by Bauer and Swanson that show that, because and they I think forcefully argue that what might be happening is that the Fed and the market react to the same data, but because we get the blue chip forecast only once a month, it actually looks like the market is reacting to the Fed, but it's not really the case. I think that's a very nice paper and argues. I'm not saying information shocks are completely irrelevant, but at least reading their paper made me think that they're rarer than you might think. And finally, so in terms of the Sundaram and Stein relation to that, they're related, and in their paper, gradualism backfires. The reason is that we have some common ingredients, like when you raise the rates and the long-term rates go up, but they have a model where that's costly. When the long-term rates go up, maybe it damages the financial institution balance sheets. We don't have that. So in our model, there is no cost to changing rates. But if you introduce costs like that, then you might get, some effects like that. You might want to sort of be more gradual, and that might backfire. We don't have those things. In fact, in our baseline model, if you think about that, if it still wants to reveal its information, because there's no cost to changing rates, you just want to hit your target. But really an excellent discussion, also food for thought. Markus, your question: if you do the Fed meetings every two weeks, that would help with the communication, but I would sort of say the governors and the FOMC members are already speaking to the public quite a lot. So we're already maybe effectively in that regime. In terms of whether it could actually make the Fed's belief less relevant to think about shortening the period in our model, I don't think that would help, because the reason I think this monetary policy delays is not because of the timing of the policy, but it's just because when you change the policy rate, there are real economy delays. When you change the rate now, it affects the economy a year from now, for a variety of reasons. So if you do the meetings more often, that wouldn't help with that, but it would help with the communication probably. So that's a great point. But let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Alp and Jenny, for great paper and discussion. So I now take the charge in terms of presenting my own paper, and you intervene with questions, I guess. Let's see whether things are working. Can you see my slides? Okay, so now we have the final paper of the session. That's joint work with Sebastian, Merkel, and Yuliy Sannikov. It's titled Debt as Safe Asset. So what do we try to do in this paper? We would like to understand what is a safe asset, what are the features of safe assets, what role does retrading play, and when do you lose this safe asset status? And safe asset will be mostly here government debt, and how much government debt can the market absorb. And we will show there's a debt Laffer curve, and this is related to debt sustainability analysis from the fiscal side. And actually government can run a Ponzi scheme in terms of rolling over existing debt forever. We will also address the more recent literature on debt valuation puzzle for the US, but we would argue that this, if you take the traditional view as the previous literature did, and for Japan, it would be even more dramatic, this debt valuation puzzle. And we argue for a modification of reps wage and asset pricing, and also of the fiscal theory of the price level equation, especially when R is smaller than G. Now, let me just give you an inkling about the fiscal theory of the price level and the debt evaluation phenomenon. So you have essentially typically the nominal value of all the bonds outstanding from the government divided by the price level. The real value of the government debt is the expected present value discounted primary surpluses. And of course, if the market believes the primary surplus will be lower, then the real value of the government debt will be lower. Hence, the price level will go up, meaning there is inflation. So that's the FTPL, fiscal theory of the price level, playing out. And the question is, if you look at Japan, from 1960 onwards, you have essentially primary surpluses are negative for the last 60 years, except for 7 or 8 years in the 80s. Okay, so you plug this in, you get negative numbers, and then suddenly this should become a positive number. So something doesn't square up. And if you look the next 60 years, I would argue it doesn't look like there will be primary surpluses in Japan. So hence there's something wrong with this FTPL equation. And what's wrong is, of course, there's a term missing, which is the bubble term. So particularly if the risk-free rate, the interest rate on government bonds is smaller than the growth rate, you have a bubble term showing up here. And you need this bubble term in order to understand the fiscal theory of the price level. Now, if you do this more formally, of course, you have this bubble term showing up here. But let's suppose you have a primary surplus, which is negative, but it's always a fixed fraction of the GDP, and GDP is growing at a rate of G, so the primary surpluses are growing at a rate of G, becomes more and more negative, growing at the rate of G, and you discount it at the rate R, which is smaller than G, then this is still minus infinity. It's a negative number which grows, becomes more and more negative at the rate of G, and you discount it back at the rate of R, which is smaller than G. So this becomes a negative minus infinity term. So you have to have the bubble term to be plus infinity in order to get this FTPL equation to work. Of course, in theory it works, but it's not really useful. You need all the other equilibrium conditions in order to really figure out what is the value of the real value of the government bonds. So what we want to do is we want to provide an alternative interest rate you discount, and we call it R double star, and you will see later on why double star, which is larger than G, such that the first term is still negative because it's all negative numbers, but it's not minus infinity, it's minus a finite number. And the last term is plus a positive number, but it's not plus infinity. And summing these two up, a negative number plus a positive number gives you some positive number here. And then the question is, what is this R double star? And it has to be such a number which is meaningful. And what we will argue, there's a particular number, I will show you this number, this discount rate, such that this is a meaningful representation of what's going on in terms of asset pricing and evaluations. And this will be a meaningful term in a sense that is a discounted present value of some service flow. And the service flow comes from the safe asset feature of the government bonds. Okay, so here essentially any asset price, this holds for any asset price which provides some service flow. And let me just, for simplicity, and the service flow comes from the safe asset thing, and that gives me an explanation what a safe asset is. And because a safe asset gives you extra service flow, typically a standard asset doesn't give you. And what is this service flow? So let's think a simple example. Let me switch off this cash flows or primary surpluses. So I just make this zero. So essentially the real value of government bonds is just given by the service flow. And here's a very stylized illustration of that. I have just two people, Alice and Bob. They have essentially two assets, a safe asset, which is has service flows. And I will show you what the service flow is. It pays no cash flow at all. Okay. And they have in the other portfolio, they have a second asset. It's a cash flow asset. The cash flow asset has real cash flows. That's a regular asset. And it is such that Alice and Bob's shocks on the cash flow asset are perfectly negatively correlated. Because in the model, we have a continuum of guys and they all have idiosyncratic shocks. But let's here for simplicity, because there are only two guys perfectly negatively correlated. So if we move up the world, Alice cash flow is positive shock and Bob has a negative shock. If we go down, it's exactly the opposite. And the big assumption essentially is that Alan and Bob cannot trade contingent claims to reinsure each other. They're natural for each other to insure. They have negatively correlated shocks, perfectly negatively correlated shocks, but they can't insure each other. But what they can do is they can buy this essentially purposeless, useless asset, seems like has no cash flows whatsoever, to self-insure. Okay, so they can say, we hold this asset, the safe asset, but if this stage realizes, then we swap this asset, this white asset. Bob will sell it to A in return of this cash flow asset. And if we go down, we trade the opposite direction. So by holding this cash flow, zero cash flow asset, they actually can partially insure each other ex post. So they hold ex ante for precautionary reasons, precautionary savings reasons. They hold this asset, which gives them the service flow of the benefit of being able to partially insure each other ex post. Depending where the shock comes, they can swap the cash flow asset for this white asset, either in this direction or in the other direction. Okay, and that's what this safe asset does. It's a standard, and it doesn't have to give you any cash flows because it allows you to have better risk insurance across through self insurance and precautionary savings. How big the benefit is depends, of course, how big the risk is, this cash flow risk on the other assets. And it's also the case, there's one equilibrium where this white asset is worthless, and then this whole thing doesn't work. So they have to bear their own idiosyncratic risk, or there's this cash flow risk on their own. Or there's another equilibrium where this asset is something worth and has a positive service flow, then it provides a service flow and has a positive value. So you see, even though you have no primary surpluses at all, you have an asset which has a positive value, and it could be even negative. Okay, so the primary surplus could be even negative, which acts like a tax on doing this self-insurance trading. Okay, so that's essentially what the government is doing. It imposes a tax on self-insurance trading, and it can reap out this benefit from self-insurance trading. Okay, so that's what we call a good, a safe asset, which is like a good friend. It's around when you need it. So the safe asset has never some cash flows, but when here, when Bob has a negative shock, he can swap use this asset, sell it, and get in the exchange. He gets a cash flow, positive cash flow asset. And here it's the other way around. So it's a good friend for negative idiosyncratic shocks. I will show you in a minute. It's also a good friend for aggregate shocks. Okay. And the second aspect of the characteristics of safe asset is that it's a safe asset tautology, which means its asset is safe because it is safe, because it's perceived to be safe. There's another equilibrium where it's not perceived to be safe. Okay, and what's special about this safe asset here is that it has this bubbly feature, and that's different. You might say, oh, this feature of this retrading might occur also in Gali type models, but you don't have this bubbly feature in Gali type models because you don't have this R smaller than G thing. And you also get this extra service flow. Part of the service flow is also collateral constraint, gives you extra service if it relaxes collateral, or if it relaxes the double coincidence of wants constraint, like say a cash and advance constraint, that's also a service flow. But we think this collateral constraint and double coincidence of wants constraint, they're actually relatively small service flow compared to really this retrading, which gives you this precautionary savings thing. And that's where the safe asset aspect comes in. Now, you might, so what is about this aggregate volatility? How is this safe asset also a good, a good friend when you go in a crisis? And the argument here, the assumption we make here, just to illustrate, when you go in a crisis, actually this idiosyncratic risk becomes bigger, which is illustrated by these black arrows here. So in times of crisis, idiosyncratic risk becomes bigger between Alice and Bob. So their shocks become bigger on the cash flow asset. Hence, they value this precautionary savings much more. And so in times of crisis, they value the precautionary savings much more, and because they value it more, the safe asset is gaining in value. Okay? So the assumption essentially is that the higher the idiosyncratic risk is, or the risk in the system is on the cash flows, the more valuable the safe asset is. And in times of crisis, when output might drop, it is actually the case where idiosyncratic risk goes up and the safe asset appreciates in value. And that makes it a particular good friend also for aggregate risks. Okay, so now we set up a model, and I don't have much time to go in details in this model. It's a continuous time model, infinite horizon, one consumption good. It's very simple. It can solve the baseline model in closed form. The continuum of agents, citizens in the country, they all have AK production technology, but they have idiosyncratic risk. So whenever they produce something, they have their own idiosyncratic risk, and they have a portfolio choice. They can hold their physical capital, produce something, get some output, or they hold a bond. And the bond gives you some nominal interest rate. It might be even in real terms negative. So it might be a tax on the holding the bond. So it depends what the government is doing. The government essentially is spending, it's taxing output and issues bonds. That's what the government does. And it can, of course, one particular tax is an inflation tax, which is like in taxing this self-insurance, precautionary savings tax in a sense. The only friction in this economy is incomplete markets. Agents cannot insure each other directly through contracts with idiosyncratic risk, but they can partially insure themselves by holding, for precautionary reasons, this safe asset. Okay, and then later on, what I will do is I will introduce that the idiosyncratic risk is actually time varying. There are certain periods in time, idiosyncratic risk is high and others where it's low, and it's stochastic whether it's high and low. That follows a mean reverting exogenous process. Okay, so here's the model. There are citizens I from 0 to 1. They all have log utility. They have a time reference rate rho, and they all produce. Each citizen holds its own capital stock. It produces A times K. Iota times K is for reproduction of new capital goods. So you have a capital stock, like say trees that produce apples. Some of the apples you sell for consumption purposes. Other apples, part of the apples you plant again to have new trees in the future. The government taxes tau fraction of the output. And that's essentially how the number of trees, the percentage of trees, how it evolves. Some of them depreciate, getting older. You have planted some new trees at a certain investment rate iota. And there's a concave function, which is, this log specification is going on here. And importantly, you have certain trees fall down and there's a storm, and others have a nice sunshine, there's a positive shock. So that's a Brownian shock on that. And you can buy some trees or sell some trees. In aggregate, this will wash out. Even the idiosyncratic shock will not, but you have essentially this shock here. That's what you have to bear. And this could be time varying. Sigma tilde could be a stochastic process itself, but for now, let me just switch off this time varying. Okay. And so all this sigma tilde, AT and GT, the government expenditure share, could be time varying, but we don't need this for now. The only friction is that you cannot trade claims on these idiosyncratic Brownian shocks. Okay. Now, what's the government? The government is, as I said earlier, is just, that's first capital stock. Capital stock is just integrating of all individual capital stocks. The government is spending little g times k. It is taxing this. And, it can issue bonds. Nominal bonds is a script B at a growth rate of mu B, a positive drift mu B. It pays interest, nominal interest rate on the government bond. So if you look at the government budget constraint period by period, say what is the tax revenue is tau times A times K. That's the total real tax revenue times the price level. That's the nominal tax revenue. What's the total expenditures in real terms? It's G times K times the price level is the expenditure. So this whole thing is the primary surplus, nominal primary surplus. This is the whole real primary surplus. And this S here in the brackets, that's the surplus per capital unit, because the capital K is essentially the size of the economy, and that becomes the real economy. You can always scale out the capital K. That's how the model is written. So everything can be done per unit of K. So it becomes a scale invariant model. So that's the primary surplus of the economy. And if you're in a deficit, you have to issue more bonds. So you issue at a higher rate than what you pay in interest. So this mu jack essentially was the bonds you issue beyond you would pay interest on existing bondholders. So that's a new bond issuance you can actually use in order to run a deficit. It could be negative, then you run a surplus here. Okay, so that's just a budget constraint. Now, if you put this model together, I don't have the time. So each agent has to make an investment choice. This iota is just a static choice. Then it has to make a consumption choice, which is because of log utility, just rho, the time reference rate, times the net worth. That's the consumption. And it has to make a portfolio choice. The portfolio choice is between physical capital, which produces output, so it has a higher dividend yield. It has produced some apples, which government bonds don't. And but it has the disadvantage that physical capital has this idiosyncratic risk, and government bonds don't have this idiosyncratic risk. Okay, so there's a trade-off between. And then there's the other thing: the government may just print more and more of these bonds and dilute the existing bonds. That's essentially a tax on holding these bonds. It pushes the real interest rate down. So all of this you have to trade off in the portfolio choice between real physical capital and holding government bonds. But nevertheless, the government bonds are valuable. They might never pay anything in the real terms. They might always be negative, but they have this reinsurance, self-reinsurance aspect. And then you can solve actually this thing. Everything is in closed form in terms of exogenous parameters. So this was the adjustment cost. This was the printing of the bubbles, or the speed of the bubble mining, how many bonds are printed at what rate. That was a time reference rate you can solve, and that was idiosyncratic risk. That's the value of a machine of or 1 tree. That's the value of all the government bonds in real terms. So that's the same term here. And that's the investment rate iota. So everything is in closed form. So the interesting thing is, we need more time to go through that. I don't have the time. So just look at the Gordon growth formula. you see that the value of an individual machine or tree is just 1 minus tau, which is times A, that's the output, minus iota is what you need for replanting. So that's the dividend essentially. Discounted by R minus G, but you have to use expected return on capital because it's a risky thing to do. So that's your growth formula here. What is that's expected return of K? We can solve this. For this, you need that. But the more interesting thing is what's the real value of government bonds? And that's the formula here. That's the primary surplus of the government. So that could be zero. We can set it equal to zero, or we can set it positive or negative. And then there's the service flow term, which is this thing. And it's also a growth formula. I see R versus G, but it's not the capital return, is actually the net worth, expected net worth return, which is, you know, the bond return with the portfolio share of the bonds and the 1 minus theta portfolio share on the capital. So that's the net worth return. So you've got a growth formula for the primary surplus. This was the first discounted cash flows. And here have the discounted service flows. The service flows is dependent on how big is idiosyncratic risk. So sigma tilde was idiosyncratic risk, and 1 minus var theta, or 1 minus theta, is the fraction portfolio share you put into capital. So if you put less into capital, you have less idiosyncratic risks. That's why this 1 minus theta shows up here. And it shows up this, the higher the value of the bond, the real value of the bond, the higher the service flow. So that's the service flow per period. It grows at the rate of G, like the economy, and that's, you have to discount at this rate. And that's essentially what the formula you get in closed form here over there, just illustrating what's going on. Now that's for where the idiosyncratic risk is always constant. It's not time varying. When it's time varying, it's more complicated. We can solve for in closed form anymore. So why do we discount at this rate? Just to give you an intuition, what is this discount rate in order to get this nice formula? And this is a finite number. So let's suppose if S is a negative number, let's 0.2 or 0.3 or whatever you want. That's a negative number and it's finite because this return is larger than G, and this is also a finite number. So it's a negative number, finite number plus a positive finite number gives you a nice FTPL equation. So that's the money valuation or the FTPL equation essentially. Now, the intuition for that is, if you come from a slightly different angle, is that what is the risk-free rate? Now, the risk-free rate and what's the interest rate on the bond? So more generally, the risk-free rate is the growth rate of, is the time preference rate, or with log utility, is the time preference rate rho plus the expected consumption growth rate minus the precautionary savings terms, which is the variance in the consumption growth plus the idiosyncratic risk in consumption. So that's the aggregate risk in consumption growth and the idiosyncratic risk consumption growth. So that's the risk-free rate. So the risk-free rate is depressed if people have to hold more consumption risk. Of course, if the government asset has risk on its own, like inflation risk or loss of safe asset status risk, there will be a risk premium on the government bond. And then they're going beyond the model. It's not part of the model. It could have also be a good collateral, relax the collateral constraint, or the rate, the interest rate on the government bond would be lower because it gives you this collateral convenience yield. But what we would argue that a big component is this idiosyncratic risk. So the idiosyncratic consumption risk. And if you take this one out, then you move this over there, and I call the whole thing a service flow rather than only convenience yield. And then I end up with this as a risk-free rate. And that's my R risk-free rates double star. Okay, so it's a risk-free rate of a planner or a repressive agent who doesn't suffer this idiosyncratic risk. Okay, so if we think of a planner doesn't have these idiosyncratic risks. That would be the risk-free rate of this repressive agent. Okay, and that rate is larger than G. It's always, you can show it's always larger than G. And I move the other component, I move into the service flow component together with the convenience yield and other stuff. And that gives me an extra term in my asset pricing equation or my FTPL equation, because now I discounted that rate. And that makes intuitive sense. Now I can discount, get a finite term, like a planner, a government, the government thinks. And the benefits which comes from retrading in all this, that's actually put in the service flow component. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing. Now the question is, so how big is this effect, and does it really capture what's going on in the real world? So we calibrate this model. So we enrich the model. First, in the baseline model I've just shown you, they were not possible to issue equity. Here we say we can raise equity. You can offload some risk by issuing equity, which then help by the others. And the model stays the same. There's only one parameter changing. In a sense, I don't have really time to go into that. And then we also we go beyond log utility. We do Epstein-Zinn calibration. So the IES is, so intertable error substitution is still 1, but we allow for risk aversion gamma to be different from 1. Okay. What do we do about time varying stochastic exposure to idiosyncratic risk? We assume now that this follows an exogenous stochastic process. So the sigma tilde itself is a stochastic process. So there will be times of high risk and times of low idiosyncratic risk. And that's driven by another Brownian without tilde, so it's an aggregate Brownian. So everybody's exposed to that. So when there's times of high idiosyncratic risk, everybody has high idiosyncratic risk. So if DC is negative, so it's a negative shock, but then actually because of the minus, the idiosyncratic risk is going up, and the whole thing is mean reverting. It mean reverts back to some sigma tilde 0, which is also a long run mean reversion thing. So that's our only state variable in the system. So sigma tilde, besides capital K, which can make scale invariant. And if there's a high idiosyncratic risk, we also assume that that's typically times of recession. So total productivity will be lower. So whenever sigma tilde is high, TFP is lower. Okay, so we could also, we only want to have one state variable, and hence we link it all to sigma tilde. And we think it's very realistic that times of recession, output is lower and idiosyncratic risk is higher. Now, you can calibrate this. You can look at the paper on the whole calibration numbers, but let me just show this figure here. So you have sigma tilde. Sigma tilde is low, means there's less idiosyncratic risk. That's the boom phase. Output is high, and everybody has to bear less risk. And sigma tilde high is the recession phase. Output is low, and at the same time, a lot of idiosyncratic risk is floating around. Now, what happens to the price of physical capital of a single tree or a single machine? It is the case that the capital price is going down. If you go into a recession, the capital price is going down like this green curve here. But the value of a government bond, the real value of a government bond, is going up. You have deflation showing up here. So there's the real value of all the government bonds is actually going up. And you see already the good friend analogy here. When you go in a recession, idiosyncratic risk goes up, and everybody wants to self-insure for precautionary reasons more and want to buy more government bonds. But then actually, that's the time when the government bond increases in value. There's this flight to safety into the government bond, and that pushes up the value of the government bond. And that's what the good value, the good friend thing is. It's like gold. In times of crisis, the value of the government bond increases. There's no, we keep the government policy very constant. There's no, time varying government policy. You can change that too, but just doing that, you have this deflationary force. In times of crisis, the value of the government bond, the value of the safe asset increases. Or put it differently, the asset price is the present value of cash flows plus the present value of service flows. And if I separate the two, of course, I can only trade them in bundles, but the cash flow, if you go in a recession, if sigma tilde goes up, the present value of cash flows is going down. If you go in a boom phase where sigma tilde goes down, the expected present value of cash flow is going up. But the service flow is a much bigger component than the cash flow for US treasuries or Japanese government bonds. Essentially saying when we go in a crisis and idiosyncratic risk goes up, the service flow, the red thing, is going up significantly compared to a boom phase when idiosyncratic risk is low. And if we add these two lines, you get this dashed black line here. So that's pretty much showing it. And you can also see that the government bond has a negative beta, because when idiosyncratic risk goes up and output goes down and we're in a recession, the government bond increases in value. It's a nice hedging feature for the bondholders to have this feature where in times of crisis, the government bond increases in value. And that's what a safe asset is, or it's like the gold aspects of this as well.
Markus,
now,
sorry, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Related to that? So this is very interesting, but like, it's a coordination issue, right? If I understood correctly, there's also an equilibrium without. So
That's correct.
can you comment a bit on why you think people coordinate on the government debt as opposed to gold or even Bitcoin or something arbitrary? And related, like if there's something special about government debt, let's say, because in very extreme scenarios, the US government will be able to pay back its debt. You know, could you do a version of this without the bubble element, but keeping many of the models?
So there are two aspects to it. So one is, how can it be that, why is it government debt? And one big component to it is that if the government has enough fiscal capacity, it can raise taxes in order to support the bubble. It only has to do it off equilibrium. I was saying it just has to say to the public, if the bubble were to burst, we will raise the taxes, and we have the institutional framework, and we can then support it, and then the bubble will never burst. Okay. The second question, I mean, you split it in two. The second question is, why can't Apple do that? And the argument we make is that essentially government is more forceful. If as private institutions would steal this bubble component, the government would make sure it will take it away from the private institution, keep it with the government. Okay, so it has taxing enforcement power to enforce a particular equilibrium. Of course, that goes beyond the analysis in the paper, but the government has features, regulatory features and other things to make sure that, you know, this government bond enjoys the safe asset status.
Thank you.
So that's a very good question. So let me just go quickly to the debt Laffer curve, and just to show you what's going on. So you can actually run a primary deficit all the time, okay? And why? Because you essentially tax precautionary savings motives. And so you issue debt at a faster rate, and if you issue debt at a faster and faster rate, you essentially tax this precautionary savings higher and higher. So it's a tax rate you leverage, you get a higher tax revenue. But it also means you destroy your tax base. So if you tax this precautionary savings, and people don't want to do so much precautionary savings anymore, the value of the government bonds goes down, and that's your tax base. And this reduces your tax revenue. So the tax revenue is this product between tax rate and tax base. If you increase the tax rate, you get higher tax revenue, but if you increase it so much, then the tax base goes down. And when the tax base goes down, your tax revenue, one factor of this product is going down, and at some point you reach the Laffer curve. So what we do is we look at this Laffer curve, and this calibrated version, that's the growth rate of the bubble, not the growth rate of the nominal bond, the issuance growth rate, and how much can you fund of this primary deficit? It's at about 2%, okay? And it matters a lot in a dynamic model where the idiosyncratic risk goes up in times of crisis. If this dynamic risk, if the risk would not go up, the idiosyncratic risk in times of crisis, the Laffer curve would be way lower. It would be something like this. I don't know whether you can see my mouse. So what we did is we cranked up the sigma tilde as idiosyncratic risk significantly in order to have the same peak here. And you see, so this dynamic effect that the idiosyncratic risk is going up in times of crisis not only lifts how much you can fund in terms of primary deficits, but it also allows you to issue way more in terms of the growth rate of the bond rate is much, much higher. Okay, because the feature, this aggregate good friend, is really important quantitatively. So purely from a theoretical perspective, you can get this purely by idiosyncratic risk being a good friend for idiosyncratic shocks. You get already a lot out of it, but quantitatively to get a huge fiscal capacity out of that, it's this aggregate effect that idiosyncratic risk goes up in times of crisis. So being a good friend for aggregate shocks is really important. Now, this goes a little bit what Alp was saying. So this debt sustainability analysis, the second aspect of this was bubble can pop. And so the question is, does a government have enough fiscal capacity to prop up the bubble? It only has to do it off equilibrium. So in the sense saying, if I want to in the US, I can introduce a value-added tax, and then I can actually prop up the bubble. So I don't have to do it in equilibrium. I just have to credibly communicate I'm able to do that, then the bubble will not pop. And that's essentially where you need essentially some spare fiscal capacity in order to support the favorable equilibrium the government is in. And you can see if you don't have this fair fiscal capacity, actually the return on the bond is the risk-free rate plus a risk premium. And of course, this should be below G in order to run your Ponzi scheme phenomenon. So if you shrink the fiscal space, and then the risk premium might go up, and at some point you go beyond the G point. The other thing goes beyond the model, we assume here that the risk-free asset or the safe asset you can trade without bid-ask spread. If you have a bid-ask spread, it loses its role as a retrading tool. Precautionary savings means you can easily sell and buy it and get in and out very quickly. So it has very high market liquidity. If it loses the market liquidity, like what the US Treasury did in March 2020, then you lose the safe asset feature. You wouldn't buy the US Treasury anymore if you can't really buy and sell it. If you get a negative idiosyncratic shock or positive shock, you go for some other asset. And that's why this market maker of last resort for the central bank is very important to act as a market maker of last resort if the intermediation of the markets don't work anymore and the market microstructure doesn't work anymore. So let me conclude. And a safe asset, in our view, has two features, two characteristics. One, it's a good friend. And it's a good friend against individual shocks. And it's also a good friend against aggregate shock. But the aggregate shock is a little bit more subtle. It is because whenever there is a crisis, consumption drops, and at the same time, idiosyncratic risk goes up. So it's more useful in crisis. And because it's more useful, it's more available. So it increases in value in bad times. So it gives the whole safe asset a negative beta. And because it gives it this negative beta, it makes it a very attractive asset in the front. And being able to issue this safe asset is a huge privilege because you issue an asset with a very low interest rate or even negative interest rate, real interest rate, because it gives you these other service flows, this retrading, precautionary savings service flows. And the second thing is, if R is smaller than G, then it's a bubbly feature, so it can go away. So you have to be careful not to lose it. And what helps here is to have, this fiscal capacity, to have this off-equilibrium threat that, you can support this equilibrium if it needs to be. The second aspect I would like to make is this. Of course, people talked about this convenience yield, that government bonds have a convenience yield. But we think the service flow term from this retrading coming from this precautionary savings is way bigger than a little convenience yield because you can use it for collateral or something like that. So it would be way bigger. So in order to calibrate this, it turns out the service flow term is way bigger than just the convenience yield showing up. And then coming from the other direction, from the fiscal side, from the government side, doing fiscal debt sustainability analysis without taking this into account, you should conclude that, Japan and many countries don't have a fiscal debt sustainable framework. But once you take this into account, you can support some fiscal expansion to some extent, but only to some extent because there's a debt Laffer curve. So it's not like MMT, there's really a lot of fiscal capacity. It's limited, but there's extra space by being able to do that. And finally, we can also analyze once your safe asset competes with other safe assets, and that's a little bit what Alp was alluding to, saying, why not private assets? So within a country, you might compete with some private bonds. And across countries, you might compete with some other safe assets from other governments. And that's where the US monetary policy spills over. So you might have a country where your own national bond serves as a safe asset and people do the precautionary savings in their own safe asset. As long as the US monetary policy is low, that's fine. People do this. But when the US Treasury becomes sufficiently attractive because the interest rate is going up, then they say, why should we do precautionary savings with our national bond? Let's switch over to the US Treasury. It's a much better safe asset. And that kills essentially the local safe asset. And that actually makes it much harder for an emerging economy to preserve its local safe asset status. So that's all what I wanted to say. And I think I ran a bit late, but I have 2 minutes left, but there's one question. Do you want to speak up or can I do something? Hold on, let me stop sharing. I don't think I'm in control. There was one question. Can you comment on how distribution distributing debt across different tenures rather than setting total spending and debt might stimulate the level you describe here. As you know, the US Treasury allocates across tenures, but Congress sets. But tenures, I mean different maturities, I presume. So in this model, what we have assumed here, there's no different maturities. Oh. Stephen Neary would like to answer this question live.
No, please go ahead.
I should go ahead, or who should go ahead? Sorry.
Yes, sorry for the interruption. Yeah, I was just moving it over.
Okay. So essentially, in the I theory, so that this is a special case essentially of the I theory, there will be different maturities that, and if different people hold different maturities by conducting monetary policy or general government policy, you redistribute wealth, and this way you can stabilize the situation and recapitalize certain fractions of the economy which are undercapitalized. And this model, it's more simplistic in a sense that all agents there, of course, have heterogeneous wealth levels depending on the past experience of their positive or negative shocks. So there will be rich and poor guys, but they all aggregate nicely because they're all scale-up versions of each other. So it means, for example, Alp is 10 times as wealthy as I am, and I see him smiling. And he will just do everything 10 times as large as I do. Okay, so he has 10 times the wealth, 10 times the bond holdings, 10 times the capital holdings. But in terms of portfolio shares, everything in shares, we look alike. Okay, but just he's 10 times bigger than me. And this makes the model very attractive because it aggregates nicely and can solve it in closed form. Once you allow for more rich heterogeneity, which we do in the I theory, we have different groups. It aggregates within each group nicely, but across groups, you have to keep track of a state variable, the relative wealth share. But then you can say, okay, now we have different groups have different holdings of different maturity of bonds, and then we change the relative price of these relative bonds. Then you redistribute wealth across these groups, and then you can stabilize the economy, you can enhance the economy or slow down the economy, depending how you redistribute wealth. And that's essentially what is different tenors or different maturities of debt come in here. And that also gives you, of course, a rich dynamics, also not for interest rate implications, but also for QE. But QE is essentially changing relative prices between short-term reserves and long-term government bonds, for example. There's Andres Schneider asked the question, would ZLB affect some of the conclusions? If nominal rates cannot go down any further during recessions, inflation needs to materialize for R to go down in bad times. Yes, so we have not, so this is a model with flexible prices, so we don't have essentially nominal frictions, and we don't have a zero lower bound. And that's, if you were to impose nominal frictions and zero lower bound at some point in this type of models, it could be that the interest rate is going down and you would like to stimulate the economy by having a low interest rate and you can't do it. Then it would be additional effects would come in, and we have not analyzed this. It links to some work I think Alp has done before showing what these effects are and get demand externalities. So that would be additional to that what we have done. This. How would the result vary if you allow for default? That's Dimitri asks that. So if you allow for, so the first thing is we have to go beyond log utility, because with default the wealth would go negative or zero, and the log utility would not be well defined anymore. So, but we can do that, go beyond log utility, and then you can analyze that. It's easier to handle. So what we cannot analyze if there's a default by all guys, because I said all guys are scaled up versions of each other. So if I default, Alp defaults too, because everything is 10 times bigger for Alp. So what we really need is idiosyncratic shocks lead to default. So it can't be the aggregate shock. And that you can analyze. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. We haven't done that. We did in a related work in the AR paper with Yuliy. In the 2014 paper, we had idiosyncratic shocks and then default with the idiosyncratic shocks, which just affect the risk premium. but it's not priced to such an extent because it's idiosyncratic shocks. And this would actually work as well. Once we generalize going away from log, generalize the log, and focusing really on idiosyncratic shocks leading to default. Okay, so this means I ran already 3 minutes over time. Hope there's another. If you have heterogeneous holdings of debt maturities, any intuition regarding whether bubble measures would vary across maturity or would it equalize across maturities under certain assumptions? So the way the one way to see it is the following: is that take all government bonds together and as a portfolio of all government bonds, and then there's a bubble component to it. And then the question is, how do you slice it across the different maturities? There's some indeterminacy. So it depends again how the government enforces it. So it could be that the bubble component is very on the long-term bonds or very on the short-term bonds. And you can see that it can jump, like in March 2020, essentially the bubble component on the 10-year treasury went away and it just moved. Everybody wanted to have US reserves. So it moved, so you can lose the safe asset status on part of the maturity structures. We haven't gone into this. I'm speculating here beyond. It's an interesting question by Ahe. And so it moved away from the 10-year treasury, it moved all to US. It didn't go abroad, it stayed within the US, but it moved to the US reserves. So everybody wanted to have US reserves on very short-term treasury bills. So that's an interesting thing. So far for this particular paper, you only have one maturity, but one could enrich that. And in a sense, you have competing safe assets within the country, but within the government bonds, because there are long-term bonds, short-term bonds, and there are also different safe assets competing with each other. And then it depends very much what you think the government, the political game, will they enforce their fiscal capacity to enforce it in general? Will they also enforce it for long-term bonds? And typically, I think they would enforce it. And after the Fed stepped in and intervened dramatically in March 2020, that showed a clear signal. We will actually support our 10-year treasuries as a safe asset. And then immediately it came back. A very good question. So, okay. So I thank you all. I think the great speakers and Jenny as our discussant. And I wish you a great serving to the next conference session, which I don't know when it starts, how long the break is, but probably it's pretty soon. So thanks again to all of you, and perhaps Steve should take over or just leave and then everything will be handled automatically.
Thank you,
Markus.
Thanks a lot
for sharing the session.
Thanks, Philippe.
Thanks for all the questions.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Jenny.
Bye. Yep.
Bye.
Thanks, Alp.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.